Well, it is indeed an honor to be here with you, and looking forward to a topic I love to speak on. Difficult, to deal with the constraints of, a 45-minute to an hour talk on something that one teaches classes on. But it seems to me the topic is as relevant as ever, particularly if you kind of follow Catholic news. You might have read of a recent Midwestern bishop who's issued a pastoral letter calling for a thank you. Calling for a pretty dramatic purging from our church of the spirit of Vatican II. So we may come back to that a little later. Professor Baldwin mentioned that I was speaking to the Canadian Bishops' Conference, and it was a wonderful experience. Some great guys, and I enjoyed as much as anything kind of sitting around the dinner table. And I have to say, one of the unexpected surprises I had while I was there was hearing an unusually large number of bishop jokes, which, I think is a fairly rarefied subset of, in the whole history of humor. And normally I don't begin with jokes, but I have to say a number of them I found particularly amusing, and since they were told by bishops, it seemed to me okay to do so. So in this particular case, and this is apparently a story fairly well known in Episcopal circles, but I think we're free of that here, so this might be safe. Anyway, the bishop tells the story of another diocese in which a priest had a particularly testy relationship with his bishop. He had been petitioning him about a pressing matter in the parish. He felt the bishop was avoiding him. It was getting really irksome. He would call the chancery. He'd leave messages day after day. After a while, the bishop wasn't even responding to him at all, and so the priest decided to make a preemptive strike. On Sunday, during the celebration of the liturgy, at a key point in the Eucharistic prayer, a part with which many of you are familiar, he prayed, strengthen in faith and love your pilgrim church on earth, our Pope, Benedict, our Bishop, James. All of us are familiar with this. What you may not be familiar with is when a bishop prays that, he says, and me, your unworthy servant. So the priest said, our Pope Benedict, our Bishop James, your unworthy servant, and then continued on. So word gets back to the chancery. The bishop is understandably rather irate, calls the priest, says, what do you think you're doing? The priest innocently says, I was praying nothing more than what you pray every time you celebrate the liturgy, Your Excellency. To which the bishop replied, yes, but you meant it. So, enough of that. I want to talk about the Second Vatican Council, which is arguably one of the most important historical realities to understanding contemporary Catholicism today. One of our most eminent scholars on the Second Vatican Council, Joe Komonchak, says there are at least 3 different ways in which to assess the Second Vatican Council. We can understand the Second Vatican Council, first of all, as an experience, a profound or a set of experiences that many people had who lived through the council. And those who remember, if you were, for example, here in the United States, articles by journalists who were covering the event. I know any number of priests and colleagues who were at Rome at the time and talk about their experiences of seeing some aspect of it. We have memoirs from theologians, periti, and bishops who are at the council. And so one way to look at the council, and it can be tremendously fruitful, is to think of the council as an experience or a set of experiences that people had of this momentous occasion. A second way, and from a sort of an academic point of view, this is probably the way we're most accustomed to thinking about the council. That's to think about it from the point of view of church teaching. And so if you take a graduate course here in the School of Theology and Ministry, I'm sure you're required, rightfully so, to read the documents of the Second Vatican Council, to look at those 16 documents and to understand the teaching, the normative teaching that is contained within those documents. But there's a third way of understanding the council. Komonchak talks about that, and that is to understand the council as an ecclesial event, as an occurrence that constitutes a kind of break, an interruption with the ordinary way in which the church progresses, an event that sort of stands out in a way that forces us to rethink what it is to be church. All right? And so I'm going to talk primarily not about experiences, though that's a fascinating thing, but primarily back and forth between the idea of the council in terms of its teaching and the council as an event. So I want to talk about a conciliar vision. I'm going to lay this out a little bit and say, well, the first thing, and it might surprise you to recognize this, is that getting a hold of the conciliar vision turns out to be not nearly as simple as many of us would think. Now, most of us have a sense. We think we know what that conciliar vision is. But the truth of the matter is there are a lot of countervailing currents that are part of the council in terms of the council's event and its teaching, and it's not always so easy to capture sort of the essence of what the council was about. So this whole business of trying to lay hold of a conciliar vision is something worth doing, necessary to do, but also something that I think has to be undertaken with a certain amount of caution. See, there are issues here, and I think this is significant. There are issues about how exactly you interpret the council. For example, I'm going to pick a couple of people that might be well-known figures for you. One of them would be Mother Angelica. Most of you, I would guess, are familiar with Mother Angelica. She's right now in very poor health, but has been for a long time a fairly outspoken public religious figure, not afraid to speak on matters of import in the life of the church. And I'll mention another figure, a former professor of mine, Father Richard McBrien. Also a fairly well-known figure in the life of the church. And I would pose to you that if you went to Mother Angelica and you went to Richard McBrien and you said, what do you think of the Second Vatican Council? I'm pretty confident that you would get some version of the following. I think the Second Vatican Council was a great gift for the church, and it is a tragedy that it has been misinterpreted for ideological purposes. And what the church desperately needs right now is an authentic interpretation of the Second Vatican Council. I think both of them would say that, but they don't have breakfast together on a regular basis, you see. In other words, we have a few people, and now more, these folks are mostly schismatic people, who want to deny the council altogether. But the debate really in the Catholic Church today is not whether you're in favor of the council or not. It's a debate about what the heck it means to speak of the council and its influence on the church. In other words, it's a debate about how to interpret the council. This is a question, in other words, of hermeneutics. And it's a topic that's just now, I would say in the last 10 years, begun to get a significant amount of attention. I think that's an interesting fact in itself because, for example, the Catholic Church, I think, has for the last 50 or 60 years, a pretty impressive body of literature and reflection on biblical hermeneutics. And I'm happy to say that I think it's almost impossible for us anymore, to put out students from any reputable graduate program in Catholic theology without their having a pretty good understanding of the nuts and bolts of biblical exegesis. I would hope that's the case. I'm sure that's the case for anybody who graduates at this school. It strikes me, therefore, as somewhat odd that we have so many people who can read Scripture in such a sophisticated way and read ecclesiastical documents in such an unsophisticated way. You see what I'm saying? In other words, somehow we leave all of that sophisticated hermeneutics behind when it comes to reading Scripture, and we engage in what in Scripture study we call proof texting. Right? Does that follow? Okay. So there's been a lot of work, and I think a lot more needs to be done about how we interpret the council. Pope Benedict XVI has also weighed in on this debate. He gave a very influential address around Christmas season in December of 2005, in which he articulated two different hermeneutical visions, two different ways of understanding the council, and not surprisingly, he had a preference for one or the other. And so I'll mention those briefly. The first one he mentions is a hermeneutics of discontinuity and rupture. All right. Now, for him, this is a way of interpreting the council that privileges discontinuity over continuity. This is the approach that wants to celebrate everything that's new and different that the council brought about, while minimizing the elements that were continuous or that were developing in a far more organic way. All right? So, for example, this Midwestern bishop who just issued a pastoral letter, and I think, by the way, there's some merit to his concern, said, you know, I'm not sure it's the best thing in the world for us to get in the habit of talking about pre-Vatican II pastor and post-Vatican II pastor, pre-Vatican II parish and post-Vatican II parish. This suggests that somehow there's this huge break that took place in this period from January 25th, 1959, when Pope John announced the council, to December of 65. I mean, after all, it is, he says, the same church. And I mean, to a point, I would agree with him. I think sometimes there are people who, in the name of the so-called spirit of the council, evoke sort of their, you know, cherished imaginings about what the council might have done, but they're not necessarily rooted in what the council actually taught. So, you know, for example, when somebody suggests that when the American League instituted the designated hitter rule, that came from the spirit of Vatican II, we're probably pushing the spirit of the council a little bit too far, all right? But I also want to say that while I think there's a reality to this at the popular level, I mean, I think there are a lot of people who, you know, have a positive sense of the council or a negative sense, but in fact haven't studied the council at all, who make sweeping claims either in favor or against the council because they haven't read it, they haven't studied it. I tend to believe, and this is my own opinion, that this is a bit of a straw man, a figure of straw at the more academic level. That is to say, I personally know very few serious academic studies of the Second Vatican Council that posit a radical discontinuity. I'm not saying they're not out there, but to my own view, that's more the exception than the rule. All right? Now, the Pope then goes on to say, there's another way of reading the council, and he refers to this as a hermeneutics of reform. Now, to some extent, I think this makes a lot of sense, and his use of the word reform is very important there. He's not denying that the Second Vatican Council changed some things. He's not denying that the council brought about new insight, moved the church in new directions, responded to particular inadequacies in our practice, in our theological understandings, and so on. But he would say we must see those changes within the broader framework of continuity. So he wants to speak of change in continuity, all right? And I have a personal suspicion, one that I'm not yet convinced enough of to run it up the academic flagpole, that what we are seeing here a little bit is the influence of a 19th century German romantic understanding of the development of doctrine that's willing to see development in fairly organic terms as this continuous flowing development and increase and maturation, but is uncomfortable with the idea of the development of doctrine that might involve dead-end streets, U-turns or reversals. Does that follow? All right. So I want to be very clear here that the Pope is not advocating a reading of the council that just wants to whitewash over change, but he wants to make sure that we place the reality of the council's reform within a larger narrative of continuity and organic development. All right? Now, my guess is, or my sense is, that there's a little bit more that needs to be said about this, and that these two paradigms are not altogether satisfying. First, because I think the first one's a bit of a figure of straw, and secondly, because it seems to me there's got to be a little bit more of a balance in understanding continuity and discontinuity at the council. Ormond Rush, in a very simple book, but one that I think is very insightful on the question of conciliar hermeneutics, he's an Australian theologian, says, you know, maybe we need to take that rupture language and think about it a little bit more carefully. After all, as Joe Komonchak said, I mean, that's what it means to say the council's an event. What it means is that means there's a rupture. There's something that erupted that's forcing us to look at things with new insight, all right? And so Rush says, maybe we need to distinguish between what he calls macro-ruptures and micro-rupture. A macro-rupture would be a thoroughgoing repudiation of something central to our tradition, whereas a micro-rupture would be a genuine break with some aspect of the tradition, but one that in fact can be read within a larger framework is rejuvenating some neglected element of the larger tradition. All right? And I think that distinction's more helpful, because there's no way, from my point of view, that you can read the council and not come to the conclusion that there are genuine ruptures. All right? There are 90-degree turns and sometimes 180-degree reversals that take place at the council. We can finesse them away, but I think they're really there. Did they repudiate the whole tradition? Not at all. Did they, in fact, oftentimes bring us back to something we'd lost sight of? Very often they did. All right? So that's just a word about the kind of the difficulties, the dangers, the complexities that we have to deal with when we talk about conciliar hermeneutics. All right? Now, what I'm going to do now, and this is really dicey because there's no way to do this without trafficking in generalization, caricature, and all of that. And so I just need you to recognize that. But I want to briefly summarize what I think were some of the key, if you will, micro-ruptures or significant shifts that took place at the council. Because if we're going to talk about fulfilling the vision of the council, we do have to try and say, well, what are we after there? What are the big movements, all right, that the council was pushing us toward, all right? And so I'm going to give, and we could do so many, but I'm going to pick 4 as I think pretty significant. First, I want to say there's a shift from a juridical, clerical, and triumphalist account of the church to a sacramental and theological account. Now, the language there, particularly in the first part, is taken from a very influential intervention that was made by a European bishop who was not happy with the preparatory draft on the church that the bishops were given during the first session. And he gave a very well-known speech at the council in which he said, well, nice start, guys, but there's some small problems. And then he says, it's juridicist, that is, it treats the church from the framework of canon law. It's overly preoccupied with the question of jurisdiction and power and all of those kinds of things. Secondly, it's clerical. He treats the laity as if they're an afterthought. And third, it's triumphalist. Huh? We have all the truth. The chapter in there on ecumenism, there's a chapter in there on religious tolerance, which says a great deal about sort of the dominant Catholic understanding of ecumenism at the time of the council. You know, the dominant approach to ecumenism had been articulated by Pope Pius XI in his encyclical Mortalium Animos. And he articulates a vision of ecumenism that could be summed up this way: we're right, you're wrong, come back to us. All right? Now, I mean, it's more subtle than that, but not a lot more. All right? Not a lot more. And so the council, the draft that they received was still mired in that first vision. When you map the history of the De Ecclesia schema from its first draft to its final form, what is so striking is how much it moves away from that juridical framework to an appropriation of a robust, theologically, sacramentally, and biblically informed vision of the church. Now, Lumen Gentium doesn't offer a systematic theology of the church, and I think it's a mistake to look for it. But it's a series of profound reflections on various aspects of the church that recover the Trinitarian foundations of the church, that recover not as much as some of us would have liked, but more than before, a pneumatological understanding of the church that recovers in a very important way an eschatological understanding of the church, the pilgrim church that will not achieve its perfection until the consummation of history. All right? A theology of the church that's sacramentally grounded in baptism and sees the church built up and nourished by the celebration of the Eucharist. This was a very important shift and, if you will, micro-rupture, all right, with what had come before, what had gone before. Second, there's a move from a siege mentality, a fortress mentality, us against them. Even in our Catholic social teaching, if we read the important contributions of Rerum Novarum and Quadragesimo Anno and so on and so forth, there's still a sort of us against the world, you know, like we're standing from the fortress walls denouncing everything that's going on bad out there. All right? And there are lots of, by the way, historical reasons for that. I mean, one could argue that from the 16th to the 20th century, the church had been progressively under attack from what it perceived as external forces. So one can understand how that siege mentality might have developed. But regardless of its causes, the council decisively moves from that to a more dialogical understanding. Boston College's own distinguished scholar, John O'Malley, talks about how if you read the council documents, on almost every page, you see some reference to dialogue. Huh? I mean, dialogue is part of one of those deep themes that shot through all of the council documents. So what we see is dialogical engagement with other Christians. So ecumenism is no longer the ecumenism of return. It's the ecumenism of the decree on ecumenism, which looks at the great divisions that have divided us and admits with humility that errors were made on both sides. Huh? It's an approach to ecumenism that starts with what we have in common before dealing with perduring differences. All right? So again, respectful dialogue. When we look at what the council taught about other religions, again, from the perspective of 2009, in some ways not as much as we would like, but from this perspective of 1965, an important advance in its treatment of Judaism, and a limited but nevertheless respectful treatment of other religious traditions as well. And then in the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, and my own candidate for the most mature theological document of the Council, Ad Gentis, the Decree on the Missionary Life of the Church, which contains some of the most mature reflection on the Church that I think you'll find in the Council. There's a much more positive, still critical, but positive and constructive attitude of dialogical engagement with the world. All right? Third, a shift from a mechanistic view of the church's sacramental life to a genuine liturgical theology and spirituality. All right, this is obviously most dramatically the case in Sacrosanctum Concilium, all right, the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, where we see, and again, I'm trafficking in generalizations, of course, but immediately prior to the Council, though there were important developments already afoot in the area of liturgical scholarship and liturgical studies, still it would have to be said that sort of at the level of the person in the pew, the dominant theology of sacraments had a kind of formalism, a kind of mechanistic, we do this, this happens. The image I have, it's crude, but I mean, it comes from my own childhood. It's a soft soap dispenser where you push the plunger down, you get a little daub of soft soap, you know, and the sacraments, the church was like the soft soap dispenser that dispenses, you know, sacramental graces. Now again, crude, but at the level of religious imagination, for many people, maybe not all that removed. And then we turn to Sacrosanctum Concilium, and we find the beginnings of a profound liturgical theology grounded in the triune life of God, grounded in the Paschal mystery, grounded in the assumption that it is the whole gathered assembly under the presidency of an apostolic minister that is the historical subject of the church's worship, with important allusions, maybe not as developed as we would like, to the eschatological character of the church's worship. And I haven't even addressed the other sacraments, right? And a very important shift that takes place at the Council. One that, from my own point of view, and this goes back to that hermeneutical question, is difficult to articulate simply as a sort of organic flowering, but constitutes a pretty sharp shift. All right? Finally, from governance over the church to leadership in service of the church. Right? When one reads the sections of the Council that are dealing with church governance and church office, so primarily Lumen Gentium, chapter 3, Christus Dominus on the decree on the bishop's office, Presbyterorum Ordinus. Again, there's much as an ecclesiologist I'd pick apart, but the overall tone, for the most part, is from the bishop and priest as ruler. I mean, even when the Tria Munera are discussed, the threefold office of Christ, as priest, prophet, and king, as often as not, the documents will refer to the kingly office as the pastoral or the shepherding office, all right? And attempt to try and move to a much more pastoral understanding, servant understanding. The language of service and its synonyms, again, relying on John O'Malley's study, is strikingly evident in the Council's documents. The language of ruling and exercising jurisdiction, much more muted. All right, so this is at least something of the vision of the Council that we have to ask the larger question, how do we fulfill that, right? I mean, this is a bold agenda. all right, that did set the church on a different trajectory. Did it renounce what came before? No, it did not. Are there discernible continuities with theological developments and understandings before the council? Absolutely. But that granting that cannot allow us to in any way diminish the sense that there's a new trajectory of development, all right, that the church was called to there. So, given that vision, given its significance in the life of the church, why is it that there is a pretty strong feeling among a pretty significant number of people in the church that we've not realized that vision to the extent that we would like? Now, this is sort of a glass half full, half empty sort of scenario, right? I mean, many people are fond of quoting the great Yves Congar's assessment that the teachings of any ecumenical council typically require, 50 years minimum. Right? And if so, we're approaching that point right now. And then you can go back and forth and say, well, yeah, but most of the last councils did not offer this kind of, sweeping shift. On the other hand, one could also say, but we have the tools of modern communication, which in some ways should allow us to advance at a faster pace. So you can play this game back and forth. The point I want to say is I think there's a feeling among a significant number of people that at best, at worst, there's more work to be done. All right? So what are some of the reasons, though, that things haven't worked well? Well, before we do that, let me talk about success stories, all right? And this is always the danger of this kind of talk, I'm not going to give as much attention to the successes as I should, so I guess I'm a glass half empty kind of guy. But I don't in any way want to minimize the ways in which there's no doubt we have made tremendous strides in implementing the vision of the council, all right? The expanded role of the laity, all right? There's no doubt. Now, this is an interesting thing, by the way, because I think the council needs to be credited for the expanded role of the laity. But I also have to tell you that directly, the council didn't talk about it a whole lot. One of the things, I'll get to this in a moment, is if you're interested in Vatican II's teaching on lay ministry, that's a short paper. Okay, that's a very short paper. It doesn't say a whole lot about that. But it did open some new venues for understanding the church that would lead to the expanded role of the laity. And I think most of us consider that a tremendous gift and advance in the church. All right? We have to speak of, I'm going to be critical of the liturgical reform in a moment, but before I'm critical, I have to talk about the real advances. When we talk about the embrace of the vernacular, when we talk about the strides that have been made in encouraging the assembly to have a sense that they are active participants in the worship of the church, the advances we've made in the full, conscious, and active participation in the liturgy that is demanded by the nature of the liturgy. Actually, I'm not convinced we've really communicated that last part well. I think we've encouraged people in the pew that it's a better liturgy if you participate. I'm not sure we've got to the really radical claim that their participation is demanded by the nature of the liturgy. There's a difference there, you see? It's one thing to say it's a better liturgy if we all sing and participate. It's another thing altogether to say the very structure and dynamism of what we're about requires your participation. I'm not sure we're there yet, all right? But in any event, there's a lot to celebrate here. I think perhaps the most important engine for pastoral renewal in parishes in North America has probably been the recovery of the catechumenate. In many places, a tremendous engine in many parts of this country. I can't speak of other places in the world for pastoral renewal. And we could go on and talk about the real advances that have taken place here, all right? The dialogical approach to ecumenism. Where we are right now compared to where we were when Pius XI wrote his encyclical, we've come a tremendous distance. One thinks, whatever one thinks of whatever happened today, may I suggest to you that the announcement today about the Anglican Ordinariate, though not above criticism, still could never have happened without the advances of the ecumenical movement in a way, all right? And that's an altogether different topic, but worth considering. We consider the 1999 Joint Declaration on Justification that ends 400 years of opposition on a central teaching of the Church. You just can't ignore the significant successes that we have to credit the Council to, and our ability to implement the Council's vision. I suppose when people like myself then say, yes, but there's so much we haven't done, I think the tendency is probably to focus much more on structural questions, institutionalization. That is to say, I think we've made a lot of gains in some of the theological insights and vision of the council being inculcated in the life of the faithful, but some of the formal institutionalizing of what the council was after has been a decidedly more mixed bag. And so let me mention 3 areas where I think the implementation has been flawed at best. First has to do with the implementation of collegial structures. One of the most important and most debated teachings of the Second Vatican Council was Lumen Gentium Chapter 3's treatment on collegiality, which taught that supreme authority for the universal church was exercised by the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, but also by the entire College of Bishops in communion with the Bishop of Rome. That is to say, the whole College of Bishops shared in pastoral leadership of the universal church. All right? Now that was a very important and much debated teaching of the Council. It redressed a centuries-long, well, not centuries-long, it redressed an imbalance that certainly had been sort of formalized at Vatican I, which offered a very important document on the papacy, but essentially said nothing about the episcopate or anything else, or to say nothing of the laity. All right? So the Council offered a very important teaching on collegiality that's articulated in Chapter 3 of Lumen Gentium and in Christus Dominus. But, of course, collegiality is not just an idea, huh? I mean, it's a way of leading. And so, by definition, it needs some kind of structural form, some kind of institutionalization. Now, the bishops recognize that at the Council, though, in a way, one of the inevitabilities of this is that so much energy was spent at the Council debating the principle, huh? That there just wasn't a lot of energy left to talk about its formal institutionalization, you see? I mean, it was so much just to get the words on the page that granted this that it was hard to push for a lot more. That doesn't mean they didn't try. All right, Cardinal Alfred of Utrecht, before the council even started, made a proposal that perhaps the church might look east, might look at the Eastern churches that had formal, permanent standing synods of bishops that would support a metropolitan or a patriarch in the governance of the church that was part of their pastoral responsibility. During the council, one of the most cantankerous and fascinating figures, Patriarch Maximus IV Saig, the Melkite patriarch, who was 84 years old, who belonged to a church for whom Latin was not the language of the church and therefore refused to speak in Latin during the council. All right? Maximus said, you know, we have this tradition in our churches, and we are part of the Catholic communion that has standing synods of bishops that participate in the pastoral leadership of the church. At one point, there was a letter signed with 500 signatures from bishops that was sent to the coordinating council, coordinating commission, calling for the establishment of a formal synod. What happened was that Paul VI acceded to their request, but in a problematic way. He issued a document before the council ended, Apostolico Solicitudo? I think that's it, something like that. Anyway, but in which he created a synod of bishops, all right? That's the good news. But there are 2 problems with it, and the second is much documented, but the first is actually, I think, more to the point. This is a document responding to a request from the bishops for an institutional form for collegial decision-making that the Pope issued without consultation on his own authority. You see the problem there, right? So it's kind of hard to believe we're taking this notion of collegiality seriously when he just does it on its own. And what he creates is not a permanent standing synod of bishops with deliberative authority, but rather an occasional gathering of select numbers of bishops that would meet, well, there are 3 forms eventually, but initially that would meet once every 3 years, right? That would be only consultative in character, that would have its topics chosen largely by a Vatican Commission, in which propositions would be sent to the Pope in the hope that he would incorporate them into a document summarizing the synod that he wrote, and in which the only propositions he sees are those that get 95% agreement from those at the synod. So the good news is we got a structure intended to embody collegiality. The bad news is, by most accounts, it was kind of a weak version of it. Now, it's not to say synods haven't done much good. I mean, we have a synod going on now, a special synod, all right, that I think is making a real impact in the life of the church. And I can mention any number of synods that have in fact done that. But even granting the important contributions of these synods, it's hard to ignore the fact that it seems to have fallen far short of what the council had in mind. Does that follow? Yeah? Okay. Make sure I don't lose too much time. Second, the liturgical reform or the liturgical renewal. Again, glass half full, glass half empty. A lot of important advances here. And the promise of the liturgical reform early on was great. Pope Paul VI created a special commission of bishops and liturgical experts whose task it was to take Sacrosanctum Concilium, the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, and implement it. I mean, because it was calling for essentially a revision of the Roman Missal and all of the liturgical books and rituals and so on and so forth. And so this commission known as the Concilium was created, and it was a remarkable commission. It was led by Cardinal Lercaro, and its secretary was one of the most distinguished and indefatigable liturgical scholars of the time, Annibale Bonini. At one point, they had as many as 200 consultants, theological experts working on this. The Concilium existed from 1964 to 1969, and it was a remarkable venture because largely it was working on its own, independent of the Curia, all right? Then in 1969, an important decision was made to essentially shut down the Concilium and transfer the still ongoing work of liturgical reform to the Congregation for Divine Worship. All right? And the Congregation for Divine Worship continued to do, by and large, a pretty good job. Though, as Piero Marini puts it in his very, I think, interesting first-hand account of his experience of all of that, he says what nevertheless starts to happen in '69, even though maybe people weren't conscious of it, was a certain curialization of the liturgical reform. All right? So '69 to 1975, it's the Congregation for Divine Worship, and then in 1975, the Congregation for Divine Worship is combined with the Congregation for the Discipline of the Sacraments. And at this point now, what starts to happen is the energy, the dedication to the liturgical reform begins to peter out a little bit. Remember, at one point there were 200 experts working on this. 1975, it's down to 17 scholars working on this. Now, still some important work is being done, but what we begin to see is a kind of unevenness in the kind of realization of the Council's vision. Rita Ferroni, in a book that she's written, I think makes a good point by saying, if you want to see the unevenness, compare the rite of Christian initiation for adults with the rite of penance. Now, they came out within 2.5 years of one another. One seemed to benefit both from solid historical scholarship and genuine pastoral concerns. The other was, frankly, much more of an uneven bag. And when you look at what could have been, what had been proposed, it's hard not to be a little bit disappointed with the final product that one received regarding the rite of penance. So, again, this process of the curialization of liturgical reform has left some people grateful for where we are now, but also a little bit regretful about what might have been and what maybe still could be if we were to continue in the trajectory that was set for us at the Council. Last, I want to speak of the 1983 Code of Canon Law. On that momentous day, on January 25th, 1959, when Pope John XXIII gathered 17 cardinals at the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls of Rome, he did not, in fact, announce an ecumenical council. What he announced was nothing less than the platform for his pontificate. And that platform had 3 planks. First, he announced his intention to convene a diocesan synod in Rome, which, by the way, was important symbolically because it reminded us of an ecclesiological fact we often can forget. The Pope is Pope only because he's first bishop of the local Church of Rome. So his calling a diocesan synod was, in fact, striking. The bad news is it was a disaster. And a lot of people used it as an argument. We can't even plan a diocesan synod in Rome, and we're going to do a council for the whole church? All right. But anyway, that was the first. Second, he intended to convene a new ecumenical council. Third, he called for the reform of the Code of Canon Law, then in force, which had been promulgated in 1917. Now, very quickly, the decision was made to put that last one off. As the council went forward, it became very clear you can't reform the code until we finish the council. Still, some have suggested that we may have tried to reform the code too quickly after the council. After all, I want you to remember that the concilium that was supposed to implement the liturgical renewal was trying to implement one document. All right? The work on the renewal of the code, reform of Code of Canon Law had to integrate the teaching of 16 documents. Does that follow? All right? And the work was undertaken so quickly that Eugenio Correco, for example, speculates that he's not sure that we had enough time to really allow the vision, the theological vision of the council to mature. So what happens is, as the preparation for the revision of the code takes place after the council, for example, each subcommission was given the section of the code of the 1917 code, which they were then to revise in the light of the teaching of the council. Well, that immediately narrowed the focus of the reform of the Code of Canon Law, because the starting point was 1917, now weave into it the council. Does that follow? Well, that's not always so easy to do. And so what some would say happened was, we have a Code of Canon Law, 1,752 canons, that quotes the council documents at length, but did not necessarily internalize a systematic theological vision of the council. So, for example, if you go to Book 2 of the Code of Canon Law on the people of God, in some ways an important advance, but there's almost nothing in there about the baptismal priesthood or the sense of the faithful, one of the most important teachings of the Second Vatican Council in Lumen Gentium 12. Right? The sense of the faithful, the idea that the whole people of God have this supernatural instinct for the faith that comes from baptism, that allows them to receive God's word, to penetrate it more profoundly, and to apply it more fully in their lives. What that you would think would call for, right? If you took seriously this idea that all the faithful have this gift to discern God's word, what would you expect in the code? Structures that would allow us to hear the testimony of those gifts. And yet the Code of Canon Law is very weak on this question. It encourages but does not require diocesan pastoral councils. It requires presbyteral councils, but only encourages diocesan pastoral councils. It encourages but doesn't require diocesan synods. It does require, and I actually think this is a horribly overlooked instrument, episcopal visitations of local parishes. And if this were done well, could actually be a fairly useful way of consulting the faithful. But I would argue that there's no way around it. The council was very weak on this point. Another area of weakness was the council's important teaching on charism. The idea that the Holy Spirit bequeaths to all the baptized charisms. According to Lumen Gentium 4, the Spirit gives to the church gifts hierarchic and charismatic. All right? And yet there's very little treatment of the charisms of the baptized in the Code of Canon Law. All right? So what I've offered here are three instances that I think were crucial for institutionalizing the council's vision. And what we have is, I think, a good start. All right? A good start, and maybe the best we probably could realistically have hoped for. But I also think it's important to realize a good deal short of what the vision of the council might have invited us to imagine, and a good deal short of what we probably ought to be imagining now. All right, so where do we go from here? Well, three possibilities present themselves. First, a renewed determination to complete what we've already started. All right? To say we've got to, continue doing the work to take the vision of liturgical renewal found in Sacrosanctum Concilium, do some more work, revising the rituals in keeping with that vision. We may need to do more work on the revised Code of Canon Law. There are a lot of people that would suggest there are very concrete things like I just mentioned that might include much more consultative structures. There are very good ecclesiological and historical arguments for rethinking how we appoint bishops. All right? There are a lot of structural things that that's worth our working towards, all right, in the ongoing implementation of the council. There are also problems with this approach. Namely, it's hard for you and I to do this kind of thing. There has to be a climate conducive to this kind of thing, and I'm not sure that we're in that kind of climate right now. In fact, there's another kind of take on the council, and it's one that I think deserves some attention. I don't want to lampoon it at all. I think, to be honest with you, in some ways, it's the vision of conciliar implementation that a lot of our church leaders have. And it's this: look, we spent 4 decades navel-gazing, rearranging furniture, doing internal structural reform. Last I checked, the council had a thing or two to say about evangelization and mission. I already told you, I think its most mature document is on mission in the world. Maybe what we should be doing about implementation is not so much focusing on internal structures and injustices and so on. Maybe we ought to focus more robustly on bringing the gospel to the world, on living the gospel, all right? Cardinal George has made a great deal of this, and he has a book coming out that I read an interesting review of and hope to read soon once it comes to me in the mail. But he's done this in a number of interviews in which he said, look, that part's done. We need to be focusing on the new evangelization. We need to be focusing on the church's mission in the world. And I must tell you that there's a big part of me that says I think he's right. I do think we sometimes undervalue the council's missiological focus. All right? And that there is a rich theology of church mission in the council that has not been fully realized. I think if we take seriously the increasingly global character of the church, we begin to see the importance of church mission. All right? The difficult but pressing questions that we have to deal with on church and culture, on questions of inculturation, wherein lies our unity, how can we enrich our experience of the church's Catholicity. There's much here that I think needs to be considered. The nagging problem for me is this. When the council spoke about the church's mission in the world, one of its most powerful theological insights was its teaching on the sacramentality of the church. That the church itself is a universal sacrament of salvation. That the church itself is in the nature of a sacrament, Lumen Gentium 1. That is, a sign and instrument of communion with God and the unity of the whole human race. That the way the church stands in mission to the world is as a sacrament. But here's the thing. Our theology of sacraments says sacraments require a visible reality. All right? A visible reality. But what is the visible reality? Well, it's certainly the individual witness and work of Christians, but it is also our institutional structures. That we can't be a sacrament to the world if our structures are countersigns. And if we have any questions of that, well, I can't imagine how we could possibly question this in the wake of what we've gone through with the clerical sexual abuse crisis. You can't speak of mission to the world without also asking questions about institutional reform and renewal. The one is necessary if our witness to the world is to have any credibility, right? And in Justice in the World, the 1971 document that came out of the Episcopal Synod, it says the church can't preach justice to the world if it's not embodying justice in its own life. So while I think there's something to be said about this, I do think it's dangerous ultimately and counterproductive to imagine that you can separate ad extra, ad intra, the mission to the world and the ongoing institutional renewal of the church. They depend on each other too much. But we do need to keep them in balance, I think. Same thing with the theology of the laity. I think we need to celebrate the importance the great gifts of lay ecclesial ministry in the church, but not at the expense of the council's bracing vision of the church's, the laity's active role in the world. All right? So, a final possibility, and I don't think it eliminates either of the first two, is that we need a new council. All right? We need a new council. Now, there's some good arguments for this. Hermann Pottmeyer, one of the, I think, the most significant German, two or three, from my view, German ecclesiologists writing today. He's now retired, but still very active. In one of his books on the papacy, used a striking image for thinking about the Second Vatican Council. He said in the 16th century, when they were rebuilding St. Peter's Basilica, they actually began rebuilding the structure of the basilica while the foundation of the old basilica was still there. And he said, in a way, that's the problem of the Second Vatican Council. We were building a new structure, but the old foundation hadn't been completely torn down. And then he goes to say the new council, the new structure that the council was building, could be conceived as like 4 pillars, 4 columns. And for him, those represented 4 seminal teachings of the council. Now, they're not the ones I chose, but that doesn't matter. So one of them was the church is a sacrament of the kingdom. Second was the church is people of God. The third was on ecumenism, and doggone it, I'm going to forget the fourth, but you can put in whatever you want. But he said the problem is we've got the 4 pillars, but no dome to turn it into a unified structure. Huh? And that's part of the problem we have with the council. Some important new developments, but standing in awkward juxtaposition with an older foundation that's still there, all right? And in a way, by the way, I would say every council is going to be a little bit like that. But it does suggest that this is in part one of the important things that ecumenical councils are. They oftentimes are looking back to what was done before, receiving it, but receiving it within a more comprehensive vision. So, for example, the students here who've studied Vatican I, I mean, it's a perfect example of this. Vatican II never repudiated anything Vatican I taught on the papacy. But it took the teaching of the papacy, which is all the key teachings that were in Pastor Aeternus are there in Lumen Gentium 25, but it placed it in a different ecclesiological framework. So, for example, in Lumen Gentium 25, it doesn't start with the teaching of the Pope. It starts with the teaching of the local bishop. Then it goes to the teaching of the whole College of Bishops in its ordinary teaching. Then to the teaching of the College of Bishops and Council, and only then to the Pope. So councils have a way of taking what came before, but putting them in a different framework. And so one could imagine the value of a new council that might undertake that kind of thing. In fact, there's a kind of, I go back and forth on this in my own mind. I mean, to be honest, in preparing this, I never was quite sure which way I was going to come down on this new council question. So I'm going to give you my internal debate here on this. All right, the pros. Reasons why I think a new council is a good and important thing. First, what I just said, Vatican II was a transitional council. Now, no, it wasn't? Oh, okay. I didn't expect you to take me on that directly, and not on this point. Your chance was earlier. All right. Anyway, I think every council is in some way a transitional council. All right. But Vatican II was much more so a transitional council than others. But here's the thing about it, and it's not a failing of the council, it's an inevitability. Frequently, the council bishops were much clearer on what they wanted to move away from than they were what they wanted to move toward. And I think an excellent example of this is the theology of the laity. They knew that the traditional pay, pray, and obey, passive understanding of the laity, the understanding of the laity that Pius X has in mind in Via Mentor Nos, the church is an unequal society and all that, that wasn't going to wash anymore. We need to say something positive. But I'll be honest with you, I think in my own read of the council is they're of two minds on it when it comes to saying something positive. On the one hand, there's a strand in the council that speaks of the indolus secularis, the secular character of the layperson, all right? But then I think they were also aware there's a danger with that, because then you can have a theology of mission in which the laity are sort of the foot soldiers of the church going out in the battlefield while the generals stay back at headquarters. And they didn't want that. And so, for example, when they used the metaphor of leaven, they used it 6 times. Early in the council, they apply it to the laity, the first 5 times they use it. But when they get to the Gaudium et Spes, it applies to the whole church. And so at tension in the council is, how do we want to do a positive theology of the laity? One way is to say, what's distinctive about the laity? Because we kind of already got what's distinctive about the clergy. Another way is to say, maybe we shouldn't be talking laity clergy at all. Maybe we should be talking Christi Fidelis, the baptized, the Christian faithful. And I think you can find elements of both in the council. They weren't sure. They were making a very important move away from another, but they weren't quite sure which way they were going as they went in the future. And I think that's just often the way it is, right? And that's why now, when we look at it, I don't think we can just receive what the council taught in the laity. I think there are questions and concerns we have today that the council can't answer for us, like lay ecclesial ministry. We won't find resources in the council to answer all the difficult questions we're dealing with. That worthwhile questions, all right? So the first reason why I think we need a new council is, in many ways, Vatican II was a transitional council, all right? It was preparing the way for something else. Second, the church today is facing pressing questions that Vatican II did not engage, all right? The council said almost nothing from our modern perspective about the role of women. Almost nothing, all right? It's inconceivable that we would have another council that would continue that. It would be more than inconceivable. It would be unconscionable. All right, it is conceivable. It would be unconscionable. All right, let me change my wording there. All right, it is conceivable, unconscionable. Both of those, it seemed to me, to be strong arguments for the idea that we need a new council. That as much as there's still a great deal of richness in the council to unpack, and I'm not arguing that at all. There's still much that we can draw from, much that we've not implemented. There are also important issues, important questions that the council's not going to help us with. All right? And I haven't said anything about social questions. I mean, when we read part 2 of Gaudium et Spes, I mean, it's just, it was envisioning a different world than the world we live in now. All right? Cons. Much still to be done with Vatican II. One could make a real good case. Why do we need a new council when we haven't implemented the first? All right, I get that. There's some value in that. I think at the end of the day, and this next one probably trumps everything else, current Vatican leadership is operating in a cautionary mode. Now, I'm not standing in judgment on whether that cautionary mode is appropriate or inappropriate. That is a prudential judgment. But what's undeniable is that there is a sense of caution. Caution about interpreting the council, caution about implementing the council. In that particular ecclesiastical climate, it can be risky, told the council. Though, I would argue that it may seem no less inhospitable than the context was in 1959. So, but you're rolling the dice, all right, on this in some real ways. So, I have no easy answer to this. I think questions about a new council should not be seen as statements about the success or failure of Vatican II. From my mind, it's impossible not to see the council as a tremendous success. But see, here's the thing about ecumenical councils. They're not like legislative sessions or constitutional congresses. You know, Yves Congar, one of his great contributions to ecclesiology, is he said, if we're going to talk about councils, we have to place the council in the context of what he called conciliarity, a fundamental way of the church, being in communion with one another. And that what councils are simply more dramatic events, more dramatic actualizations of what the church always is. Which is, it seems to me, another way of saying that we always are living to and from councils. In 1951, Karl Rahner wrote a classic essay on Christology, 1,500 years after Council of Chalcedon. And the title in English of it was a Council of Chalcedon, End or Beginning? And of course, his argument was both. And I would say, so it always is with councils. There are agendas that are set, and councils respond to the agenda, and their responses pave the way for the next. Plans, remote preparations for Vatican III, or what I hope will be Nairobi I, or Manila I. Pastoral plans, in a way, began in December of 1965, when Vatican II ended. Thus it has always been. One of the passages that I always take comfort in, and for me is inspirational in thinking about the pilgrim journey of our church, is the famous passage from the Venerable Bede, "Each day the church gives birth to the church." Thank you all very much.